The wind howled across the wide Wyoming plains, dragging dust and sleet through the air as if the land itself had grown restless. Wyatt Reed pulled his coat tighter, the old wool scratching against his neck. His hat tugged low to block the sting of the storm. The lantern in his hand flickered with each gust, its small flames stubborn against the dark. He had meant to stay inside, to let the wind rattle the shutters and the barn groan on its own. But the horses had kicked up a fuss, and a man living alone had no choice but to tend to what kept him alive. His boots sank into the cold dirt, each step heavy with the years he carried. The barn stood quiet, nothing broken, no reason for the commotion, yet his bones told him something was wrong. He turned back toward the house, but then he stopped. The wind screamed, but beneath it came another sound, faint and ragged. A voice, strangled and desperate. "Please open it, I cannot breathe." Wyatt froze, his heart hammering against ribs that had long grown used to silence. He lifted the lantern higher, turning toward the old storage shed leaning crooked near the cottonwoods. No one used it anymore, not since his father had stacked it with broken tools and warped boards. Yet the sound came again, muffled, gasping. "Please, someone, I cannot." His hand went to the revolver at his hip. He pushed the warped door open, the hinges shrieking like a wounded thing. The smell hit first, sharp and metallic, the memory of blood and fear hanging heavy in the air. The lantern's glow spread weakly across cracked shelves and rusted tools, and then it fell on something that moved, a burlap sack, tied tight with rope, shifting just enough to prove there was life inside. Wyatt dropped to one knee, his fingers working quickly at the knots. Whoever had done this had meant for the person inside to suffocate, to vanish without trace. The sack gave way, the cloth rough against his hands, and a face emerged from the shadows. A young woman, barely more than 20, her lips cracked, her skin mottled with bruises, eyes wide with terror. A filthy rag gagged her mouth, her wrists marked by rope burns, her blonde hair matted with sweat and blood. She coughed hard when he pulled the cloth from her mouth, air scraping through her throat like sand. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried all the fear the storm outside could not drown. "Please, do not let them take me again." Wyatt stared at her, the lantern trembling slightly in his grip. It had been years since anyone had looked at him like that. Years since he had held anything fragile enough to break. He lifted her gently, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She gasped at the warmth, but clung to his shirt as if it was the only anchor left in the world. He looked once more into the dark corners of the shed, jaw tight, before kicking the door shut behind them. The wind screamed across the plains, but inside his arms the faintest breath of life clung on. And Wyatt Reed, alone no longer, carried her toward the waiting fire. Wyatt pushed the door open with his shoulder, careful not to jolt the burden in his arms. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them, chasing off the bitter edge of the storm, but the woman shivered so violently he feared she would break apart. He laid her gently on the cot near the hearth, the thin blanket crumpled beneath her, and only then did he step back, his breath heavy in the quiet. Her lips moved, though her voice barely rose above a whisper, words broken and desperate. "Do not let them take me again. Please, do not let them." He crouched beside her, lantern light catching the deep bruises along her arms and the raw lines of rope burn around her wrists. Whoever had done this had meant for her to vanish, meant for her to be nothing more than silence, carried off by the wind. Wyatt's jaw tightened as he reached for the basin, filling it with water warmed by the kettle on the stove. He poured a small measure of whiskey into it, the sharp scent stinging the air, then dipped a cloth and wrung it out. She flinched when he touched her, eyes wide and frightened, but he spoke low and steady. "I am not here to hurt you. You are safe under this roof." Her eyes flicked up to his face, searching for lies, then dropped again. He dabbed at the cut along her temple, cleaned the dirt from her cheek, and pressed the cloth to her wrists where the skin was raw. She gasped at the burn of the whiskey, but she did not pull away. When he paused to let her rest, she spoke again, her voice like broken glass. "Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Sawyer." Wyatt nodded once, as though carving the name into his memory. "All right, Miss Sawyer, you need rest." He crossed to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, the hinges creaking as he opened it. For a long moment he stood still, staring at the folded wool coat inside. Dark green, its buttons dulled with age, the faint scent of lavender and cedar still clinging to the fabric. His hand lingered at the collar before he lifted it free. He had not touched it in years, not since the day he buried Clara on the hill behind the barn. His chest ached as he carried it back to the cot. Lydia's eyes opened at the weight settling across her shoulders. She touched the coat with trembling fingers, as if she knew it was not just cloth but memory. It swallowed her thin frame, and for the first time since he had found her, her breathing slowed. Wyatt adjusted the quilt, tucking it beneath her chin with a care that surprised even him. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "No one will touch you here, not while I draw breath." Her lips parted, a thank you unspoken, but her eyes closed before she could finish. Wyatt pulled the chair close to the fire, sat with his elbows on his knees, and watched the storm beat itself against the walls. He had vowed nothing to anyone in years, but tonight, with a stranger wrapped in his wife's coat, he found himself bound again, not by grief, but by a promise he could not turn away from. The morning broke gray and bitter, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs as Wyatt stepped out onto the porch with his coffee tin in hand. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet, and the hills lay under a thin veil of mist. He let his eyes sweep the land as he always did, counting fence posts, listening for the restless shift of the horses, measuring quiet against memory. At first all seemed still, but then his gaze caught on something wrong near the barn. The mud was churned too deep, the earth gouged in a way his own stock could not have made. He set the coffee down and strode forward, each step heavier, with the sense that he was not alone. Fresh hoofprints cut into the soil, broad and recent, their edges sharp with no sign of softening. He crouched, pressing a calloused hand to the ground, feeling the damp warmth still clinging there. These tracks had been made in the night, while he sat inside, tending the stranger on his cot. His jaw set tight. He rose, following the line of prints around the barn, past the trough where the water sloshed faintly from the night's wind. And then he saw it. The dog lay crumpled in the dirt, the stray that had hung around the ranch for weeks begging scraps. Its body twisted unnaturally, a clean hole through its skull. Wyatt knelt, his lantern-burned eyes narrowing. The riders had left their mark. He had seen this sort of thing before, cruelty made into a calling card, a message nailed into the earth. His chest tightened as he looked toward the cottonwood trees, and there, burned black into the bark, he saw it, a rough scar of flame carved into the shape of a mouth stretched wide. Redmouth Riders. The name hissed through his memory like poison. A gang known for stealing women from wagons, stage stops, lonely roads. They sold them to saloons and mines, turned them into shadows that never returned. Ruthless, precise, like wolves working in a pack. And now they had branded his land as theirs. Wyatt's boots carried him fast back across the yard, his breath sharp, his mind already turning. Inside, the woman stirred, wrapped in the old green coat. Her eyes clearer this morning, though the bruises still darkened her face. She looked up when he entered, reading the hard lines in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He grabbed a lantern, his rifle, and a shawl, his tone clipped but steady. "Put your shoes on. We don't have time." Fear flashed in her eyes, but she obeyed, wincing as she stood. He led her across the yard to the old hayshed, pulled the warped doors open, and revealed the trapdoor beneath the stacked crates. He pried it up, the hinges groaning, and the dark mouth of the storm cellar yawned before them. She froze, her hands trembling. "I have been locked away enough," she whispered. His voice was low, firm. "This is no prison. It is a shield. You said they would come, and you were right." After a long moment she nodded, climbing down the narrow steps into the cool, dry, dark shelves, lined with jars of beans and flour, stood along the walls. An old cot slumped in the corner. Wyatt set the lantern on a crate, its light soft against the stone. He reached to his belt, unhooked his revolver, and placed it on the shelf beside her. "If anyone comes down those stairs who is not me, you point and pull." Her eyes widened. "I don't know how." "You'll learn," he said. his tone flat but steady. "And if you cannot, then you scream. I will hear it." She touched the weapon as if it were a snake ready to strike, then glanced up at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You don't even know me." He held her gaze, something unspoken pressing in his chest. "I know you want to live. That's enough." He closed the hatch above her and bolted it from the outside, reinforcing the shed doors with beams and scrap iron. Then he stood in the yard, the wind curling dust around his boots, his eyes on the horizon where trouble always rode. The riders had sent their warning, but Wyatt Reed had already answered. No one would touch her under his roof, not while his heart still beat. The cellar smelled of dry earth and cedar, the air cool against Lydia's bruised skin as she sat hunched on the cot. The lantern burned low, its glow soft against the shelves lined with jars of beans and sacks of flour. She turned the revolver Wyatt had left her round and round in her hands, the metal heavy and unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. Above, she could hear the faint rhythm of boots on the porch, steady as a heartbeat, telling her he was near. For the first time since the sack had been pulled from her head, she felt she was not utterly alone. Wyatt descended the narrow steps slowly, his shoulders filling the doorway until the hatch shut behind him. He carried a tin cup and a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. He set them down without a word, his face unreadable in the lantern's glow. Lydia's fingers trembled as she reached for the water, sipping carefully. The silence stretched long, but it did not feel cruel as it once had, when men's silence was filled with menace. This silence was steady, heavy, but safe. She set the cup aside and pulled the quilt closer around her shoulders. Her voice came low, broken but determined. "I have tried before," she said, her eyes on the dirt floor rather than on him. Wyatt lifted his gaze at the sound, but he did not speak, waiting. "Twice," she went on, her breath hitching. "The first time I broke a bottle and ran. I made it 2 miles before they caught me. They beat me so badly I could not walk for days." Her hands gripped the quilt tighter. "The second time I hid in a supply wagon. I made it all the way to a coach stop. Thought I was free. Thought I would see light again." She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "But one of them found me, dragged me out in front of everyone. Said I belonged to them. Said if I ran again they would kill me slow." Wyatt's jaw tightened, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes, hard as stone when she first saw him, softened in the lantern light. He still did not speak, but she felt the weight of his listening, the way he gave her words a place to fall. She blinked fast, fighting back tears, and for the first time her shame eased just a fraction. She whispered, "I do not know why I am still alive, but I want to live this time. More than anything, I want to live." The words hung in the small room, trembling, fragile. Wyatt leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet, rough, with something buried deep. "Then you will." She lifted her eyes to his, startled by the certainty in his tone. His face was weathered, carved by grief, yet there was no doubt in it, only promise. For years his silence had been a wall, a cage he built to keep ghosts from pressing too close. Now, as he sat across from her in the dim light, his silence felt different. It wrapped around her like the quilt, not empty but steady, not loneliness but companionship. Lydia breathed a little easier, her shoulders loosening for the first time since she had been dragged from the wagon. Wyatt said nothing more, but he did not leave. He sat there, the revolver still on the shelf, the storm above pressing at the walls, and in that quiet space between two broken souls, something began to shift. The afternoon sun slanted low, laying long shadows across the pasture. Wyatt had spent the day mending a section of fence, his hands working steady and sure, but his eyes never strayed far from the ridgeline. He knew the tracks he had found were no accident, and he knew the Redmouth riders never left a warning without meaning to return. The land was too quiet, the air too still, as if even the wind was holding its breath. The silence broke with a faint thud of hooves. Wyatt straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow, as 3 riders appeared on the southern road. They came slow, deliberate, the kind of pace that told him they were not passing through, but coming with purpose. He stood at the edge of the porch, rifle leaning easy in his hands, though every muscle in his body tensed. The men pulled up a dozen paces away, their horses restless beneath them. The one in the middle raised a hand in a mock greeting, his voice carrying across the yard. "Evening, friend," he called, his tone smooth but edged with menace. "We're looking for someone. A young woman, brown hair. Might have wandered by this way. Doesn't talk much," another added with a grin. "But she's family. Owes us." Wyatt let the words hang in the dry air before he answered, his voice low and even. "You her kin?" The older rider spat into the dust. "Blood or bond, don't matter. She belongs with us." Wyatt stepped onto the first plank of the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. His rifle stayed steady, the barrel angled toward the ground, but ready in an instant. "Kin don't stuff a girl in a sack and leave her to choke," he said, his voice hard as stone. "If that's what you call family, then I'd hate to see how you treat your enemies." The middle rider's smile faltered. His hand brushed the butt of his pistol, but Wyatt moved first. He lifted the rifle in one smooth motion, his finger steady on the trigger. A single shot cracked the silence, the bullet striking the dirt at the hooves of the led horse. The animal reared, eyes rolling white, nearly throwing its rider. The sound echoed across the ranch, scattering a flock of crows from the cottonwoods. The three men stiffened, their hands twitching at their belts, but Wyatt didn't flinch. His rifle stayed leveled, his eyes unyielding. "Next one won't miss," he said, his tone quiet but final. For a long breath, no one moved. Then the middle rider spat again, his face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this, rancher," he snarled. "She ain't yours." "Not anymore," Wyatt answered. The men pulled their horses around sharply, dust rising in thick clouds as they wheeled back toward the ridge. Wyatt watched them until they disappeared beyond the hills, his rifle never lowering until the sound of their hooves was gone. Below the earth, Lydia had heard every word, her heart hammering as she pressed her hand against the storm cellar wall. She had flinched at the gunshot, certain death had come, but then she heard Wyatt's voice, steady and fierce, carrying a promise into the soil above her head. He had stood against them, unshaken, and in that moment, she understood. He had risked everything for her, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The storm rolled over the plains like a living thing, black clouds ripping open with silver light, thunder shaking the rafters of the cabin. Rain beat against the windows in heavy sheets, rattling the panes as if the sky itself meant to break through. Wyatt had gone to the north fence at dusk, saying it would not hold against the wind if left untended. Lydia had begged him not to go, her voice trembling against the rising howl. But he had only pressed his hand to the hatch of the storm cellar and told her to stay locked inside until his return. She tried. She sat with the lantern burning low, Wyatt's revolver on the shelf within reach, and the knife he had given her clutched in her lap. The walls groaned as if the earth itself were straining under the storm, and her breath came shallow with every rumble of thunder. Then the sound came, sharp and wrong against the rhythm of rain, the crack of splintering wood from above. She froze, her ears straining. A heavy footstep followed, deliberate and slow, not Wyatt's. The cellar door rattled as she backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. It opened too quickly, a shadow filling the frame. A man loomed, his face half lit by lightning, scar cut across his jaw, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "Don't scream," he hissed, his voice thick with malice. "Scream and I'll cut your tongue out." Lydia's fingers tightened around the knife. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs. "Boss says you're worth more breathing," he growled. "But not if you fight." He lunged, one hand grabbing for her arm. She twisted away, the blade flashing in the dim light. Steel met flesh. He roared in pain as blood streaked across his forearm. His grip tightened on her wrist, slamming her back into the shelves, jars clattering to the ground. Fear burned through her. But so did something else. Something that had grown since Wyatt had first told her she was not alone anymore. She struck again, wild but desperate, the knife cutting another line across his shoulder. He cursed, shoving her hard. She hit the dirt floor, gasping, the breath torn from her chest. His shadow loomed over her, his boot lifting to strike. The door above burst open, thunder and rain spilling into the cellar. Wyatt filled the frame, soaked to the bone, his rifle raised. His eyes burned like the storm behind him. He fired once, the blast echoing in the tight space. The man staggered back, clutching his side, then crumpled against the wall. Wyatt descended the steps in 3 strides, his fury like fire in the dim light. He kicked the man's pistol away, then crouched beside Lydia, his hands hovering before he dared to touch her. "You hurt?" His voice was rough, almost breaking. She lifted her trembling hands, the knife still clutched tight. Blood streaked across her sleeve. "Just cuts," she whispered, though her lip bled where it had split against the shelf. Wyatt reached for her gently, pulling her to her feet and guiding her upstairs. The storm still screamed outside, but inside he moved with quiet purpose, pulling a cedar chest open at the foot of his bed. From inside he lifted a blue flannel shirt, worn soft by years, the name Clara stitched faintly at the cuff. For a moment his hand stilled, the weight of memory pressing down. But then he tore a strip from the sleeve and wrapped it carefully around Lydia's arm. His touch was firm yet tender, the fabric holding fast against the bleeding. She blinked through tears, not from pain, but from the quiet devotion in his care. Wyatt tied the knot, his jaw tight. "You held your own," he said softly. His voice was different now, not gruff, but reverent. Lydia's breath shook, her fingers brushing the bandage. "I thought I would die," she whispered. "You didn't," he answered, his eyes steady on hers. "You fought, and you lived." The storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky. But in the quiet of that cabin, beneath the steady rhythm of Wyatt's hands and the scent of cedar and smoke, something stronger than fear took root. Not just survival, but the fragile beginning of trust, sealed with the strip of a shirt once worn by the woman he had lost, now binding the wounds of the woman who might yet teach him how to live again. The first light of dawn spread thin across the Wyoming plains, pale and cold after the storm. Wyatt stood on the porch with his rifle strapped to his back, his shoulder still damp from the night's rain. The land stretched quiet, too quiet, and he knew silence like that meant danger. Lydia stepped out behind him, wrapped in the coat that still smelled faintly of cedar, her eyes steady though dark circles shadowed them. "We can't stay," he said simply. She nodded, not asking where. She already understood. By the time the sun lifted over the hills, the horses were saddled, packs tied tight with jerky, water, and the map Wyatt had traced with calloused fingers the night before. He helped Lydia onto the black mare, steadying her as she swung into the saddle. She still favored her ankle, but she sat straight, her chin lifted. He mounted his gelding, the leather creaking under his weight, and together they rode west, the wind cold against their faces, the sound of hooves drumming into the waking earth. The road wound into Dry Gulch by mid-morning. The canyon walls rose high, red stone pressed close on both sides. Wyatt slowed, his gaze sharp. He felt the wrongness before it happened. The birds had gone silent, not even a crow circling overhead. He raised his hand to halt, his rifle shifting on his shoulder, but it was too late. The crack of gunfire split the still air. His horse screamed, rearing, and Wyatt jerked as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He swayed, gripping the saddle horn, his teeth clenched against the shock. Blood spread quick, dark against his shirt. Lydia cried out, spurring her horse closer, reaching for him. Another shot rang, splintering rock inches from her head. She ducked low, pulling at his reins with one hand and clutching her own with the other. "Hang on, Wyatt," she gasped, her voice breaking. 3 men emerged from the rocks above, rifles aimed. Their shadows stretched across the gulch floor. The scarred rider she had seen before grinned down, his voice carrying over the stone. "Thought you could run, sweetheart? Now you'll both die here." Lydia's pulse thundered. Wyatt slumped, his strength fading fast, and she knew if she faltered, they were both lost. She kicked her mare hard, dragging Wyatt's horse with her, darting down a narrow cut in the canyon where the rock twisted tight. Bullets chased them, sparking off stone, tearing through her sleeve, but she did not stop. Dust choked her throat. Fear clawed at her ribs, yet she clung to the reins with desperate strength, leading both horses into the shadows until the gunfire faded. At last they slipped behind a fallen boulder, where the path narrowed to a hidden hollow. Lydia slid from the saddle, stumbling as her boots struck the dirt. Wyatt nearly fell, his body heavy, his breath ragged, but she caught him, dragging him down with strength she did not know she had. He leaned against the rock, pale, his shirt soaked with blood. "Don't!" he rasped, but she shook her head fiercely. "Be quiet," she said, her hands already tearing at his shirt. From the saddlebag she pulled cloth, whiskey, the things he had once used on her. Her fingers shook, but did not stop. She poured the liquor over the wound. He hissed, his eyes squeezing shut, but she pressed the cloth firm, binding the torn flesh with the same care he had shown her days before. "You saved me," she whispered, tying the knot tight. "Now it's my turn." Wyatt opened his eyes, watching her face bent close, streaked with dust, eyes burning with stubborn fire. His lips curved into the faintest smile, despite the pain. "You ride like hell," he muttered, his voice weak but warm. Lydia let out a trembling laugh that was almost a sob. "And you bleed like a fool," she whispered back, brushing the sweat from his brow with gentle fingers. The gulch echoed with the sound of hoofbeats retreating, the riders pulling back for now. But in that hollow, beneath the shadow of stone, it was only the two of them. She held his life between her hands, her touch steady, her breath fierce, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, something bound them tighter than fear ever could. The sun was sinking low by the time Wyatt and Lydia reached the outskirts of Sage Hollow, a town so small and worn it looked half forgotten by the world. The water tower leaned to one side, its boards gray and splintering, and the saloon windows were patched with newspaper that fluttered in the wind. Dust drifted down the empty main street, as if even the air had grown tired of waiting for something worth stirring. Wyatt swayed in his saddle, pale from the blood he had lost, his jaw set tight against the pain. Lydia rode close beside him, her mare's reins in one hand and Wyatt's horse guided steady with the other. She glanced at him often, fear tight in her chest, but he gave no complaint, only a stiff nod when she asked if he could keep going. At the far end of the street stood the sheriff's office, its sign cracked, but still bearing the faint outline of a star. Wyatt dismounted with effort, his legs unsteady beneath him, but he managed to straighten his back before pushing through the door. Lydia followed, the smell of tobacco and leather drifting heavy in the small room. Behind the scarred desk sat a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, hair gone gray at the temples, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He looked up, and for a moment his mouth fell open. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, rising to his feet. "Wyatt Reed," crawling out of the dirt. Wyatt gave a faint smile, more weariness than humor. "Still breathing, Cal." "Barely." The two men clasped hands, rough palms meeting with the weight of years. Marshal Calvin looked Wyatt over, his gaze catching on the blood that had seeped through his shirt, and his expression darkened. "What kind of trouble brings you limping into my office?" Wyatt opened his mouth, but Lydia stepped forward, her voice trembling only at first. She told everything. How she had been taken from her wagon train, bound and beaten, dragged across the territory. How she had been stuffed into a sack and left to suffocate in Wyatt's shed. How the riders had come in the night, claiming her as theirs, threatening to take her again. Her words spilled into the room like water breaking through a dam, her face pale but her eyes steady. She did not look away when Calvin leaned forward, listening with grim silence. When she faltered, Wyatt's hand brushed hers, quiet and grounding, and she pressed on. She told of the scarred man, of their ambush in Dry Gulch, of Wyatt falling beneath the shot that should have killed him. The marshal's jaw tightened with each detail, and when she finished, his fist came down hard on the desk. "I've heard whispers," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Girls gone missing, stagecoaches hit, but nothing I could hold to the law, until now." He looked straight at Lydia, his eyes sharp with respect. "You're the first to speak, and maybe the only one who can." The room fell quiet except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Lydia's hands were clenched in her lap, but her shoulders eased just slightly, as though a burden she had carried alone was now being shared. Wyatt sat back, his breath shallow, but his eyes on her, seeing the courage that kept her standing tall, despite all she had endured. Calvin leaned forward, his voice steady as steel. With your word and Wyatt's, we have what we need. It's time to end this. Lydia nodded, her voice soft but firm. Then, let's end it. For all the others who never got the chance. Wyatt closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, his gaze meeting Calvin's. The riders had marked his land. They had come for Lydia. But now the fight had shifted. It was no longer just survival. It was justice. Long overdue. And for the first time in years, Wyatt Reed felt the stirrings of purpose stronger than grief. The warehouse on the edge of Sage Hollow sat hollow and leaning, its broken rafters creaking with every push of the wind. The place had not seen work in years. Dust coating the floor, wagon wheels and rusted crates piled in corners like bones, left to rot. That night, it came alive again. Lanterns burning low behind barrels, deputies crouched with rifles across their knees, every man waiting for the riders to show. Wyatt stood near the door, his shoulder bound tight, the pain still there but hidden behind the steady weight of his rifle. Lydia stayed close, her shawl wrapped around her, her eyes fierce, though her hands trembled when no one was looking. Marshal Calvin gave orders in a low growl, his voice calm, as if he had set traps like this 100 times before. The plan was simple. Lydia would stand near the open doorway, her face lowered beneath her bonnet, a figure to draw them in. Wyatt and the deputies would wait in the shadows, rifles raised, the law ready to strike. She had agreed without hesitation, though Wyatt argued against it at first. "It is me they want," she said, her voice steady. "If I am the bait, then we end it, tonight." Wyatt had stared at her, the weight of what she was willing to risk pressing heavy on him. But in her eyes, he saw more than fear. He saw resolve, the kind he could not shake. The night stretched long as they waited, the air thick with silence. Then at last came the sound they all knew would come, the slow thunder of hooves rolling down the road. 4 shadows emerged through the lamplight, their outlines sharp against the dust. The scarred man rode in front, his grin wide, his voice carrying as he dismounted. "Well, well," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd be foolish enough to come back here, girl." Lydia kept her head bowed, her breath steady though her heart pounded against her ribs. The scarred man stepped closer, his boots striking the floorboards outside, his shadow stretching across her feet. "You belong to us," he sneered, reaching out. And then the trap was sprung. Gunfire exploded from the rafters, bullets cracking sharp in the night. Deputies shouted, rifles blazing, sparks flashing against the old wood. The riders cursed and fired back, horses rearing as chaos filled the warehouse. Wyatt stepped out from behind the crates, his rifle steady despite the pain in his arm, his shot dropping one man before he could turn his gun toward Lydia. Marshal Calvin roared for the men to hold their lines, his revolver striking sparks from the wall as he fired again and again. In the chaos, the scarred man lunged for Lydia, grabbing her arm and dragging her close, his voice a hiss against her ear. "Thought you could run forever?" He raised his pistol, but Lydia did not cower this time. She twisted hard, driving her elbow into his ribs, then pulled free and struck with the knife she had hidden in her shawl. The blade cut his side, not deep enough to kill but sharp enough to send him stumbling back. Her breath came ragged, her hands shaking, but she stood her ground. "Not again," she said, her voice low but steady. "I will never belong to you." The fight raged only minutes, though it felt like hours. 2 riders lay bleeding on the ground. Another fled into the night with a bullet in his leg. The scarred man pressed against the wall, pale, clutching his side, his sneer twisted into something bitter and broken. He met Lydia's eyes one last time, but there was no victory there, no claim left to make, only the realization that the girl he once tormented now stood beyond his reach. When silence fell, smoke drifting through the holes in the roof, Wyatt crossed to her side. His face was pale, his breath uneven, but his hand found hers and held it firm. "You stood," he said softly, his voice rough. Lydia shook her head, her eyes burning. "I fought," she whispered, "and I'll keep fighting." The warehouse echoed with the sound of men gathering, the deputies checking their wounded, the marshal giving orders sharp and sure. But in the center of it all, with the dust settling, and the scarred man finally dragged away in chains, Lydia stood taller than she ever had. The weight of her fear burned away by the fire she had chosen instead. The courthouse in Fort Rock was small, the kind of place built more for land disputes and cattle claims than matters that stretched across 3 counties. Yet on that morning it was packed full. Farmers, townsfolk, even drifters crowded the benches, their whispers buzzing like flies. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes that floated like restless ghosts. Lydia sat near the front, her back straight, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. Her bonnet lay forgotten on the chair beside her, and her hair, though still uneven from her ordeal, framed a face pale with nerves, yet firm with something stronger. When the judge called her name, she rose slowly, each step to the witness chair measured and sure, though inside her chest, her heart thundered. The room seemed to press in around her as she placed her hand on the worn Bible, swore her oath, and lifted her eyes at last. At first her voice shook, the words catching on the memory of nights she had thought would never end. But once she began, she did not stop. She told them about the wagon train, the men with masks, the burlap sack, and the beatings when she tried to run. She spoke of being dragged through towns like freight, of the cruel laughter when she begged for water, of the promises that she would be sold to the highest bidder. The room had grown quiet, so quiet that the creak of the judge's chair echoed like thunder. Faces once skeptical now watched, with wide eyes, shame and anger flickering in equal measure. Lydia's voice faltered when she spoke of the nights she thought she would not live to see morning, but she pressed on, her hands trembling as she gripped the wooden edge of the chair. "I will not be silent again," she said, her words low but unyielding. "That silence is how they kept us weak. I will not give it to them any more." Behind her, Wyatt sat tall in his chair, his broad frame stiff with the weight of his own anger, but his eyes never left her. When she stumbled over a detail, his presence steadied her, as sure as if his hand had been resting on her shoulder. When it was his turn, he walked to the front, with slow steps, his boots loud against the floorboards. His testimony was shorter, his voice low and even, but it carried the weight of iron. He told of the night he found her in the shed, of the riders who came to his door, of the scarred man who tried to claim her as his kin. His words were not elaborate, but they did not need to be. Every sentence struck like a nail into the coffin of the Redmouth riders. By the end of the day, there was no denying the truth. Deputies carried out warrants, names spilled into the open, and across 3 counties, men who had once moved in shadows were dragged into the light. The scarred man would never speak again, but his silence no longer held power. Lydia's voice had replaced it, trembling yet stronger than the cruelest chains. When the gavel fell and the court was adjourned, Lydia felt her knees weaken, as if all the weight she had carried had at last been set down. She turned her head, and there was Wyatt, waiting at the edge of the aisle. He did not speak, he only offered his hand, rough and scarred, steady as stone. She placed her own trembling hand in his, and in that touch was an anchor, a vow, and the first taste of freedom that belonged fully to her. Spring came slow to the Wyoming hills that year, the snow melting in patches that revealed fresh green beneath. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the kind of scent that promised the land was ready to start again. Wyatt sat on the porch, a hammer in his hand and a tin of nails at his side, mending the rocking chair that had been broken for years. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his brow damp with the light of morning sun, and though his movements were steady, his mind wandered to things beyond timber and nails. He had lived long enough to know a man could rebuild a chair in an afternoon, but rebuilding a life was slower work, and he had almost given up on it until Lydia's voice broke through the silence. She stepped out of the cabin barefoot, the soft boards creaking beneath her steps. She wore his wife's old shirt, the one she had once wrapped around her thin shoulders for warmth, now brightened with uneven sunflowers stitched into the sleeves. The fabric looked new again, not because it was untouched, but because it had been given another chance. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper, and when she came close, she placed it in his palm. Her eyes, blue as the spring sky, met his without wavering. It was a marriage paper, already signed, waiting only for him to claim what they had already chosen in every step and breath since that night in the storm. Wyatt looked down at the paper, then back at her, his hands suddenly still. For a long moment he did not speak, only studied her face, the way fear no longer shadowed her eyes, the way strength had replaced sorrow. At last he set the hammer aside and stood, pulling her close in an embrace that spoke louder than any vow. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. She smiled, her lips trembling with something between laughter and tears. "More sure than I've ever been." The wedding was simple, the kind that fit them both. A fiddle played, wildflowers gathered by children lay scattered across the grass, and neighbors clapped in rhythm as the two stood side by side beneath the open sky. The sun dipped low, painting the world in gold, and the air hummed with warmth and laughter. Lydia wore a plain dress, her hair brushed back with daisies tucked into the strands, while Wyatt stood tall and steady, his hand firm in hers. No preacher, no grand words, just the truth spoken plain. They were not promising to be perfect, only to stay, to build something new out of the broken pieces. As the music slowed and the sky deepened into dusk, Wyatt leaned close, his lips brushing her hair. "That first night when I heard your voice, it was nothing but fear," he whispered. "But now it's home." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, though her smile was radiant, as bright as the sunflowers stitched across her sleeves. Around them the wildflowers bent in the breeze, the fiddle played on, and laughter rolled across the field like a promise. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the fear of the storm and the warmth of love found again, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comment. Your support keeps these frontier tales alive. And who knows, maybe next time Wyatt will even learn how to dance without stepping on Lydia's toes.